You're listening to the Seasteading Today podcast, where we speak to entrepreneurs and researchers who are making the dream of seasteading a reality. The Seasteading Today podcast. Stop arguing and start seasteading.
Hello, Seasteaders. This is Carly Jackson on the Seasteading Today podcast. My guest is Karina Czapiewska, one of the founders of Blue 21, the company working on floating cities that are in harmony with the environment. Karina talks about building cities that act like living organisms. It's clear from our conversation that she and her colleagues have done a lot of the tedious work of finding those little nitty-gritty regulations that prevent innovation from happening. I think Seasteaders will need to understand those challenges if we're going to be successful. And now, my conversation with Karina Czapiewska. Welcome, Karina. You are a co-founder of Blue 21 in the Netherlands. Can you tell us about Blue 21?
Yes. So Blue 21 is a company that exists for about 5 years now. And what we do is we design, engineer, and we actually also implement floating structures. And our main mission goal is to create floating cities that have a positive impact on their environment. So that means we don't only consider the human life, but also everything that surrounds the structures that will be built. Think of the existing ecology, or even trying to get back and restore the environment that once was there. So that's in a nutshell what we do.
Wonderful. Okay, so in the seasteading book, I think the company was called DeltaSync. So is Blue 21 a new company?
Yes. So we started DeltaSync more than, about 12 years ago when we were still studying. And back then, we wanted to produce floating structures, a one-size-fits-all building block. And we invested quite some time in that, and we noticed that, first of all, a one-size-fits-all doesn't exist. I mean, it cannot work because you have different locations, different sea states, different buildings, different weights. So it was a nice idea, but it was not realistic. And the other thing we noticed is that the world wasn't ready back then for floating cities. So we actually focused on everything that is needed to come to a larger floating structure. We call it cities, but you can also say we can focus first on a more floating town or district or whatever. So what we looked at were all the questions that were still open. So like how you deal with utilities, how do you provide these floating structures with water, with electricity, what materials can you use, how will it behave in waves, but also more on the legal part, what still needs to happen. First of all, we looked mainly at the Dutch law, of course, because we're Netherlands based, and there were still nothing in the laws and regulations for this. So we researched with a group of other entrepreneurs and also with the government what is needed to accelerate and to help municipalities accept these kinds of floating structures as serious buildings instead of ships. So we went all the way and we researched different paths that all lead to realizing a floating city.
Let's backtrack a bit. So let's start with talking about your philosophy around building. So you've said to me a whole process of floating urban development. So what does that mean?
So the full process of floating urban development, that consists of not only the actual building itself, but all the steps that are needed towards this. So what do you do with infrastructure? How do you design the upper, but also the structure underneath? How do you research the location, the water location? What are the different waves? How is the ecology at the present location, and so on? So actually, it consists of many steps, which the building process is only one.
Wow. Okay. And so when you put the floating pavilion in Rotterdam, was that sort of an exercise to figure out all of these different steps and different questions that need to be answered to develop a process?
Yes, definitely. So that was, we can call it our pilot. Many things were actually coming in falling into place at that specific project, because first of all, it was not only one platform that was used for humans to yeah, live on, not literally live, but use as a building. But there were two platforms which had to be connected together. Well, that is one of the biggest challenges with floating structures. How do you connect something that needs to be able to move? But we also looked at how to provide the sewer and the electricity. So we decided to do a lot at the location. So we cleaned our sewer, our wastewater, and a special boat came that provided us with drinking water. So we were kind of off the grid. The only connection we had was for the electricity, but most of the heating and cooling was also used by water exchange from heat with water. So those things, but also in terms of legislation, how did the Dutch building code, need to deal with that? So we started it as a pilot, which made it easier to get it implemented. And during that process, new findings on rules and regulations came to place. For example, a very, very crazy thing, the idea was that it will be moved after a couple of years, because there will be a big parking place built at that location. But then that was not allowed back then, because you would have to have a permit to demolish it, which is crazy, because you're not going to demolish it, you just want to move it. And then in a new location, you would have to have a permit to build it again. So those things were actually tackled during that exercise. And we gained a lot of knowledge. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I love discovering those very detailed ways in which some regulation that has been written around land development doesn't apply to floating cities. And so that's a lot of the work, it sounds like, and that you at Blue 21 are the pioneers in taking on this work to identify those types of regulations that limit the innovation of floating architecture.
Yes, thank you very much for saying that. Sometimes it really felt like that we were on a missionary trying to get people noticing floating structures and living on floating buildings, and also tackling different ideas. But actually, after a couple of years on a meeting, we met Randy Hanken back then, and he was representing the Seasteading Institute, and it was very nice we already read about the seasteading, of course, to find like-minded people. So we weren't the only crazy guys having the dream of building floating cities. There was another group of people that had the same idea, a little bit different angle, but we really had the same ideas on the future. So that was actually the first time we met you guys, and since then we always stayed in touch. So.
Yeah. So I come from the political philosophy. I came to seasteading from that side of it, but you started out wanting to build cities that in the seasteading book, they're called parasites, or that cities are not viewed as living organisms. But so can you explain a little bit about how you view a city and what the potential is for a floating city?
Definitely. So if you look at land-based cities, they are usually built with the purpose of real estate development, to house as many people as possible, and actually to close the financial deal as fast as possible. And this was the way it was dealt with for years and years. And I think we now came to a moment in time where most of us are not looking at only at the financial benefits anymore, but also on how it can benefit everyone and how it can also sustain for the next generations. I just read that we today, which kind of surprised me, as at this day we already took all the resources we can produce in 1 year, and everything we use up from this moment on is actually something that the next generations will be paying for. So usually this day comes later in the year, but we actually got the record of having that already finished now. So that's very sad. And what we actually want is, and we know we can do it, is that cities don't have to be this parasites that extract everything from their environment, electricity, water, food, but actually everything can be provided within the city, and it can even provide back. Why wouldn't it be possible? If you only take it into account from the moment you are designing it, you're planning it, you're working on it, it should be in a way that it can also give things back to their environment. And in here we again have quite some overlap with the book. What Joe and Patry are saying, that you can produce food, there can be jobs for people, it can have a positive influence on the environment, it can reuse waste, you can it's no rocket science. Everything that I'm saying now, these technologies are already existing. It's only that it's taking into account. At the moment you design it, and you always have it in the back of your mind that it also has to do this, and then it can work. It just needs people that want to do that.
Right. So the floating cities can be, or I think you're quoted in the seasteading book as saying that we look at energy and food, as separate pieces that need to be brought together in a city, but with a floating city, we have the opportunity to build something that is more of a closed system, that is that each piece of it fits together, and that's how you eliminate waste. That's how you take pollutants from the water of land-based cities and then turn them into something useful.
Yes, so it's not even self-sustaining, but ideally you can also attach to existing locations where you can close the loops and actually help to get those cities on land cleaner and more resource effective by closing the loop of different resources that go around, like once more nutrients from wastewater that can be very easily reused in food production, different sources of green waste that can of course be used as compost. We have the plastics and so on. So it's closing the loop of resources is what is possible if one can attach a floating city to a existing city.
So we've already talked about, you've done some work in reforming the regulations around building. And in the Netherlands, it sounds like you all are way ahead of the rest of us. The book says that there are 60,000 floating houseboats in Amsterdam. There's a culture of people living on houseboats in the Netherlands? Yes.
It has been going on for a long time, since 1800s. The first official houseboats were settled. That happened first in Amsterdam, and back then they were still considered boats, but in 1869 or something, they got the title houseboat, which meant that it was accepted, not legally, but it was kind of, there's a Dutch word to that. It means gedoogd. It says gedoogd, and it means that it's not quite legal, but it's accepted by the government. And since then, houseboat community gained and flourished, because it was quite an easy way to find places in very crowded cities on the water. And since then it has been growing and growing.
So would you compare these houseboats to seasteads, or what are similarities, what are differences between seasteading and these houseboat communities?
Well, somewhere in essence, you could actually see quite some similarities. There were people that actually had a different opinion on rules and regulations, and still acceptable, but a little bit different. And that was actually, and they actually, how do you say, they actually got it through. They actually managed to find these loopholes in the possibilities, and stretched the opinion of the local and the national governments to accept them and to have a sort of different status than regular homes. So that was quite funny that there are already entrepreneurs thinking a little bit different about these things. So there's a little bit of similarity, which I never really thought about yet. And on the other hand, yes, of course, there's similarities in terms of that it's floating structures that can be used everywhere. On the other hand, it's still more inland waters, and this means that you're still contained within a country. These houseboats that we're talking about right now are not suitable to be moved to other places over the sea. It's just they're too small and not solid enough.
But within the community, do they move around a bit? Between neighborhood and neighborhood.
They used to, definitely, but nowadays, especially in Amsterdam, the locations are very scarce because of the new rules and regulations. That are all over the Netherlands. They have, how do you say, they're contained to a specific location, and you have to buy or rent your location. And if you want to move, you can, but you need to make sure that you have a different location somewhere else. There is, however, a very, very small community. I don't know the numbers of that, but those are moving houseboats. So they're kind of ships, but with quite a decent house on them. And those do have different spots all over the Netherlands. But these places are scarce, so there's not a lot of possibilities. But there are a few that move around from Amsterdam to the north of the Netherlands and to the big lake, and have a few places in the Netherlands where they can rent a spot for X amount of time. So yeah, actually you do have that, but that's just a very small part of the people. Yeah.
Sure. So you've also been working on looking at land reclamation versus floating cities. Yes. Can you tell us what's going on with that?
Yes, so that's actually one of the research topics we have been focused on in the last year, because we noticed that the acceptance or the knowledge about or the necessity of floating cities was still not really. People thought, oh, it's nice and it's something different, and places for the rich, and but there was no really good, or at least accepted, incentive. And then we started thinking, well, actually it's crazy if we look at many places on Earth, especially smaller countries, but also some cities which have a lot of land behind, still are reclaiming the water in front of them. And then we thought, hey, but wait, because this reclamation, doesn't make sense in a lot of places. First of all, you just cover the whole ecology that's present there. It's just piled up with sand. The sand that you need, or other materials that you use, are extracted from another location, which also will be disrupted because it will be taken away over there. You need a lot of transportation of heavy sand. You need a lot of fuels for that, and so on. And moreover, to make a very large area, it's a very high upfront investment and quite a risky thing. So one needs to make a whole big area of sand before, and it has to sink down. You have to wait for years before you can start building. So it's also quite a risky business. So we are actually looking at when is the breaking point, when is it better to not use the regular land reclamation techniques, but actually go into floating. Of course, from the ecology point of view, it's always better to go into floating. But if you look at the depth, if you look at the circumstances and the waves, the currents around, currents take sand away, so you need kind of dikes, which will increase the cost again. So we are making a calculation model at the moment, which will determine which places are better for floating.
So I wonder with land reclamation, I just know a little bit about China trying to build artificial islands, and they were stopped by an international court from claiming or from expanding their jurisdiction doing that. So I was wondering how much of it has to do with, if you're doing land reclamation, the international law recognizes that as part of a country's boundary, whereas if you're floating, they've determined that cannot be claimed as part of territory or expanding territory.
That's a very good remark. Actually, that's not figured out yet. We are working on a European research called Space at Sea, of which we're also looking at the land reclamation. But in there, we're actually raising these questions. So if you, how do you treat a floating structure that is considered a floating city or a city expansion? How do you put that into legislation? How do you, we first thought it could be like an artificial island, but this is a whole different concept, so we cannot compare it with that. But actually, the answer on this is not been figured out yet, because the question is, what would benefit and what would be more interesting for both the floating structures and a country? Because perhaps, and then if you look, of course, at the countries that are losing their islands due to sea level rise, here it would be interesting to be able to consider floating structures as part of a country boundary, because then you still have your spots, you still have your islands, you still have your boundaries, which otherwise would disappear. So what would your ideal situation be? Because it's, as you described with the floating houseboats in Amsterdam, it seems like the land perspective of how to manage residences kind of took over and eliminated the benefits of floating, which is that you can move and separate and be flexible. Yes.
So we wouldn't, as a seasteader, I don't want to just apply the same standards and requirements to a floating city. The benefit of floating is so much flexibility and innovation.
That's a good one. Yes. So yeah, that is definitely a pro into having it still being able to move it. I don't have the answer of this question yet. We're still thinking about this. We're still looking at all the different pros and cons and so on.
So with Space at Sea, what would be your ideal with the Space at Sea project? What would you hope to see? So we're currently pointing out the questions that still need to be solved
in terms of how to answer the legislation for floating. But this one will not be fully answered in this space at sea trajectory. There will probably a next research with a different team with more people from the legal departments, because I think that will be the second for space at sea. At the moment, we are mostly oriented at the technology, and we're looking at how to develop larger floating structures. How do we? What are the best sizes for specific environments? So we're looking at the North Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. What is the best size that limits movement? How do you combine the different elements? Because you cannot build the city in one big piece. That is, first of all, very hard to do in terms of manufacturing, but it would also not be very beneficial for the sea life underneath if we would cover a big area just with one big block. So what we're looking at is separate platforms which are connected with each other, and we're testing this now and looking at how this will work, and also on how the business case of this will be. So when would it be interesting and when not?
Who are the other stakeholders in the Space at Sea project, if you can share?
Oh, there's many. One of them are also in the book. It's Water Studio, Koen. We're quite a lot collaborating with them at the moment.
So that's Koen Ultus, is that
yes.
his? And
yes.
I know he has designed version 2 of the Ocean Builders single-family seastead.
Yes, very cool. Yes, I'm very excited to see the final design of this already. So Koen, we're very close geographically. It's like 15 kilometers. So we actually work on different projects together, not like competitors, but more like companions. And we're also together in the Space at Sea research, where we together do the living at sea design part. So this is one of the other partners, and other partners are universities, for example, University of Delft, University of Rostock, of Hamburg, we work with a Romanian ship designer and engineer company called Ice Pronav. We collaborate with wind park developers, Volfu, with a dredging company, Deme. There's a lot of people. Let me think.
No, that's great. I was just wanted to get a sense if there was a big commercial project that was pushing this forward, or that it's more of a research project.
It's still more research, and eventually it's the idea to be able to use this for example, for maintenance of wind parks, for food production. We also collaborate with the University of Wageningen to test and research for how food production can be integrated, because the idea of Space at Sea is multi-use floating structures. So not only living, or not only transportation or whatever, but actually how to combine all different paths in one big you can almost call it city like structure.
So cool.
Yes.
So are you optimistic about the potential to have the first floating city soon?
Yes, I'm very optimistic because I see a lot of things happening the last years. It really seems that floating has emerged. Many new companies and designers are really looking into floating cities, and governments are accepting it more. Even the UN speaks about it. So it's not anymore some nice futuristic cool idea which will happen somewhere in the far future, but there's a lot of buzz around it at the moment. So I think this will happen quite soon. I think within the next 5 to 10 years, we can perhaps see the first large, extra large structures really happening. I mean, what is a city, right? If we look at the ocean, at the pods, at the homes that you are seasteading is now developing, yes, there will be there very soon. So you can also say that that's a small start of a city as well. So I think we are going to see this very fast. Yes. And with that, I really hope that the companies and the people that are doing this are also considering all the moral imperatives, like Joe calls them, that are also in the book, that really take care of not only the financial part, but also the environment and sustainability and civilization and so on. So.
Right. So the 8 Great Moral Imperatives is a video on the Seasteading website. And I think it's, enrich the poor, care for the environment,
cure the sick.
Cure the sick. Yes.
Yes. And it's I think every new city, every new society that wants to start and wants to develop needs to have these things in their mind and in their heart. I think, because then it will be a success, and it should not be just one of them, but it should be integrated with each other, so you can actually build upon that.
So what needs to happen in the next couple years to really bring about a floating city that does meet those moral imperatives?
I think we really just need to start building. We need to start, just get out there and really do it. Ideally join forces with all the people that are interested and are believing in this, and that want to be part of this, and that can be in many ways. Actually, already what seasteading has been doing. No matter if you're an aquapreneur or ideologist or an innovator or a real estate developer or even a governmental official, for me, I don't care. I think we need to join forces together and really just start doing it, and see this as a serious alternative to grow countries and grow communities.
That's great. I think that's a great note to sort of wrap up our conversation on. Is there anything else you would like to add or talk about?
I don't think so. The only thing I just said before already when I just talked to you is that when I got this book the first time, I read it, of course, and I was going through it once more, and then I was like, oh, wow, there's so many things in here. First of all, it's very exciting. It has so much different topics that are very relevant at the moment, and I would say it's a very good guideline on how to really make this floating city realistic. And the other thing I really like is that Joe and Patry refer to different people, different companies that are working on in the space of floating cities and so on. And most of them we actually worked with, collaborated with, or had contact with in the last 2 years. So that's it was like. It was kind of predictive on what will happen.
That's great.
So, yes. So I hope it will. Also, the bigger things in the book will also be the prediction of what is going to happen in the next couple of years.
Great. And so, how can people find you in Blue 21? Do you have any social media that you'd like to share, or website?
Yes, of course. That's blue21.nl, because we're based in the Netherlands. And I'm Karina, and we're on Facebook. You can find us on Facebook, also Blue 21, and on LinkedIn. And that's mostly it, how you can find us.
Great. Thank you so much for being on the Seasteading Today podcast.
I'm very happy to be invited. Thanks very much for inviting me.
Yeah.
The Seasteading Today podcast is produced by John Bush. Your host is Carly Jackson. Send feedback and questions to podcast@seasteading.org. To support the podcast and the Seasteading mission, go to seasteading.org/donate. If you'd like to learn more, read the book, Seasteading: How Floating Nations Will Restore the Environment, Enrich the Poor, Cure the Sick, and Liberate Humanity from Politicians. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast feed, and we'll save you a spot on a seastead.